My mother is fond of telling a story from when I was a baby. My father had just returned from Vietnam, a bit edgy, I suppose. Uh, they were asleep. My crib was next to the bed, and my mother always giggles when she gets to this part. You woke up and wanted our attention, she says. So you started to shake the bottle on your dad's face. Then my dad interrupts her as usual. I kept feeling something wet on my face, he said. The next thing I know, my mother says, I see my baby in his onesie with his little legs swinging back and forth. Your dad had snatched you up in the air, screaming. They laugh. I shudder. From an early age, my father deposited fear in my gut. With a glance, he could freeze me in place. Just a slight raise in his voice could bring me to tears. And ever since I can remember remembering, I've been trying to prove that I'm not a coward, that the fear that he put deep down in my belly doesn't control me. I suppose that's why I was initially hesitant to read James Baldwin. I knew he would ask something of me that I wasn't prepared to give. I would have to deal with my pain, my sense of wounding, with the trauma that stands as my scene of instruction. So I evaded Baldwin's work. I preferred Ralph Ellison. His mask fit perfectly. Ellison, the author of Invisible Man, Shadow and Act, and Going to the Territory, offered a sophisticated treatment of the race problem in the United States and that left the ground fertile. His nonfiction essays brimmed with philosophical and literary rigor, and I could read them with my white classmates without having to manage their discomfort. Baldwin was different. He left faces flushed or crimson red. It was bad enough that Baldwin forced me back onto myself, but reading him with my white colleagues meant that I had to manage whatever he made them feel. Obviously, I overcame my hesitation, and I've been reading and teaching Baldwin ever since, particularly his nonfiction, for about 20 years now. And as I found myself despairing and disillusioned after the election of Donald Trump, repeatedly saying to myself, they've done it again, they've done this shit again, I've reached for Baldwin to help me pick up the pieces. My pieces, our pieces. To help me imagine how to push this damn boulder up the hill again. Baldwin had gone through this too. He watched as America turned its back on the promise of the Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century. He collapsed after the assassination of Dr. King, wondering out loud, as Toni Morrison's character Stampede did in Beloved, what are these people? What are they? And he had to figure out how to pick himself up. Baldwin tried to commit suicide in '69. By 1970, he was barely holding himself together. So not only did he have to figure out how to pick himself up, but how to pick us up, because we still had the responsibility, even if white folk refused to stop being white folk. We had the responsibility of raising our babies, of imagining the country anew for them. I knew this, even in my despair and disillusionment. I knew this, so I rummaged through the ruins of Baldwin's work, and there I found what became Begin Again. The first book Baldwin wrote after Dr. King's assassination was No Name in the Street, published in 1972. That book has fascinated me over the years. It is a book about trauma. Baldwin is trying to hold himself together in the shadow of the dead and broken. He sought to tell a story about the past that would at least give us some sense of direction in an uncertain moment. The book folds back on itself. He misremembers. Narrating trauma fragments how we remember. We recall what we can and what we desperately need to keep ourselves together. Wounds, historical and painfully present, threaten to rend the soul. And if that happens, nothing else matters. Telling the story of trauma then in fits and starts isn't quite history in any formal sense. It is the way traumatic memory works. Recollections caught in the pitched battle between remembering and forgetting. Facts bungled on behalf of much needed truths. We try to keep our heads above water and tell ourselves a story that keeps our legs and arms moving below the surface and keeps the terror, stories that keep the terror from overwhelming everything. As Baldwin wrote in his last book, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, quote, terror cannot be remembered. One blots it out, end quote. The cruel irony, of course, is that the terrors move us about. We dig trenches to redirect the memories and to get them to flow away from us. But like the waters of the Mississippi River, the memories always return, flooding everything, no matter how high we build the stilts. No Name in the Street, this book published after the murder of Dr. King, after Jimmy's attempted suicide in '69, No Name in the Street is the spine of Begin Again. Baldwin's formal innovations in the text, his rejection of linear narrative, his engagement with fragmented memory shape how I engage this moment, our moment. The lie that rests at the heart of my country continues to leave bodies in its wake. That lie which holds that America is some shining city on the hill, a beacon of democratic virtue, maintains a kind of illusory innocence that has made this place, my country, monstrous. Baldwin relentlessly exposed the lie that hid this insidious idea that white people ought to be valued more than others, an idea that America has in some ways fine-tuned, but it is our inheritance. We get it from you. This idea, he maintained, and I insist we must acknowledge, has distorted American democratic life and disfigured the souls of those who cleave to it. And nothing, Baldwin insisted, and I want to insist today, nothing will change in this place, in this house of horrors, until we honestly confront who we are. We cannot tell ourselves a story of American virtue that secures our innocence. For Baldwin, quote, the country will not change until it re-examines itself and discovers what it really means by freedom, end quote. And that will involve, among other things, telling itself the truth, or better, no longer lying to itself about what it has done and what it continues to do. An essay published in 1964 with Richard Avington, an essay entitled Nothing Personal, Baldwin put the point succinctly, quote, we are afraid to reveal ourselves because we trust ourselves so little. And in this labyrinth, the person is desperately trying not to find out what he really thinks. Therefore, the truth cannot be told, even about one's attitudes. We live by lies. And not only, for example, about race, whatever by this time in this country, or indeed in the world, this word may mean, but about our very natures. The lie has penetrated our most private moments and the most secret chambers of our hearts, end quote. The United States has never been a beacon of virtue. It's not an example of democracy achieved, nor is it the shining city on the hill. We tell ourselves these stories in order to protect ourselves from what we have done. Baldwin understood that our problems in the United States go well beyond who occupies the White House or the latest example of American racism. We have to get to the rot at the heart of the matter. And this requires that we deconstruct all that the nation holds sacred, that we tell the truth so that we might release ourselves into a different way of being in the world. Americans are trapped in a history we refuse to know but carry within us. The terrors and panics we experience have everything to do with the gap between who we imagine ourselves to be and who deep down we really are. And that the nation actively evades confronting this gap locks the country into a kind of perpetual adolescence where those who desperately hold on to the American myth as some kind of new world Eden refuse to grow up. And for Baldwin, condemnation to eternal youth is a synonym for corruption. Imagine being stuck forever in Never Never Land. I can't help but connect this insight to what we witnessed over the four years of Donald Trump's presidency. And over the last few months in this country, what we're witnessing now as another Black woman has to bury her child. Americans who refuse to grow up revel in the fantasy that ours must remain a white nation in the vein of old Europe. All along, at least to me, Trumpism feels as if a kind of suppressed terror and pain lurks beneath the surface of the rants and hatreds, that the seams are unraveling and revealing the true monstrosity hidden behind a cheap-ass MAGA hat and t-shirt. But what I've learned from Baldwin is that we mustn't hide from our fears. We must run towards them. That can help us grow up. Running towards our fears can release us from those terrors that move us about. But the necessary condition for this to happen is that we tell ourselves the truth, and then a bit more. America has to choose whether it will finally become a genuinely multiracial democracy, and this involves grappling with the past that continues to haunt our present living. We have to recognize that the trouble, as Baldwin said, is deeper than we wish to think, because the trouble is in us. We must understand that imagining America anew is a moral and ethical undertaking. It must be the result of the examination of ourselves, free of the myths of America, an examination that opens up a new pathway for being otherwise. We have to run toward our fears. I barely survived writing this book in the end. Baldwin asked much of me as I sat down to write with him about our times. The sentences weren't dancing initially. The ideas weren't coming. It was only after I dealt with my trauma, my wounding, my pain. And Jimmy said to me in a voice, quote, "If we're going to do this together, old boy, you will have to deal with you." I had to run towards my fear, to admit that I'm a wounded boy with daddy issues. And that is a lesson. The unexamined life is not worth living. A precondition to say anything about the world is that you must first deal with you.